Dorothy Atwood stood on the raised platform outside the trading post at Coldwater Pass with her medical bag still open at her feet, and she pointed her finger straight at Elias Kirkwood's chest in front of 40 witnesses. "You knew that flour was cut with plaster dust before you sold a single sack of it," she said, her voice carrying clean across the dusty square. "I have treated 6 children this month for the same wasting sickness, and every family that sickened bought their flour from your store between the 1st and the 15th of June. That is not coincidence, Mr. Kirkwood. That is poison, sold for profit." The crowd murmured. Kirkwood, a broad man with a silver watch chain and a face that had never once looked afraid in the 4 years he had run Coldwater Pass as its unofficial mayor, laughed the kind of laugh that dared people to disagree with him. "The lady doctor has been out here too long in the sun," he said. "Grief does strange things to a woman's mind. Everyone knows her husband's been gone 2 years, and she still can't let go of blaming somebody for something." It was a cruel thing to say, and it landed exactly as he intended, a murmur of pity rippling through the onlookers that was worse than anger would have been. Dorothy felt her face go hot, but she did not look away from him. "My husband has nothing to do with a scale I found behind your counter rigged to read 4 ounces light on every purchase," she said. "Nor with the ledger page I have here, in your own hand, showing plaster of Paris purchased from a supplier in Helena the same week your flour delivery came in short." She reached into her bag and drew out a folded paper, holding it up though she was too far from the crowd for anyone to read it. It did not matter. It was the fact of the paper that mattered, the fact that she had won at all. That was when Nelson Monroe, sitting on the top step of the post office porch with a coil of rope over one shoulder and a stack of undelivered letters at his feet, sat forward and looked hard at the paper in her hand. He had ridden the mail route between Coldwater Pass and the county seat at Fort Benton for going on 3 years now, twice a month, rain or dust or snow, and in that time he had learned to read a ledger page from 20 feet away the way some men learn to read a poker hand. He recognized the handwriting even at that distance, the particular slant of Kirkwood's numeral 7s, because he had watched the man sign for packages 100 times. He stood up. "She's not lying," Nelson said, and his voice, though quieter than Kirkwood's, cut through the crowd's murmuring because nobody expected the male writer to speak at all. "I've carried freight manifests through this pass for 3 years. I know what an honest supply order looks like, and I know what one looks like when a man is trying to hide a thing inside it. If the doctor says she's got Kirkwood's own ledger, I'd want to see it read out loud before anybody calls her a liar." Kirkwood's eyes flicked toward Nelson with something colder than his laugh had been, something that took real measure of him and did not like what it found. "Nobody asked the male writer," Kirkwood said. "No," Nelson agreed, "but I'm saying it anyway." The year was 1885, and the town of Coldwater Pass sat where the flat gold plains of Montana Territory began to buckle up into foothills, the last trading post before the road climbed into the mountains toward the Blackfoot country and beyond. It was midsummer, the grass still green enough in the low places to remember spring, the wheat in the surrounding homestead fields standing high and heavy-headed, the kind of golden, generous season that made a person forget, for whole stretches of a day, that the frontier could still turn dangerous on you without warning. There was no permanent doctor closer than 60 miles, which was the entire reason Dorothy Atwood had ridden a circuit through 6 settlements for the better part of 2 years, carrying her instruments in saddlebags, sleeping in barns and spare rooms, and once, memorably, in the hollowed base of a burned-out cottonwood during a hailstorm, going wherever illness or injury called her because no man with a medical degree would agree to stay in a place this remote for less than city wages. She had lost her husband, Thomas Atwood, to a fever 2 years before, out past Great Falls, and people liked to say that was why she had become so hard, so willing to make enemies of important men. They were wrong. She had always been willing to make enemies of important men. Thomas had simply been the only person who ever told her that quality was worth loving rather than worth fixing. Kirkwood took a step toward the platform, and the crowd shifted uneasily, unsure whether they were about to see a public shaming settled with words or with something worse. "You'll want to be careful what you say next, Dr. Atwood," Kirkwood said, low enough that only the front rows could hear it clearly, though Nelson, still standing, caught every word. A woman without a husband, without a permanent post, without a single soul in this territory who'd miss her overmuch, ought to think hard on what kind of trouble she wants to invite. "Is that a threat, Mr. Kirkwood?" "It's a kindness," he said, and turned it into a smile for the crowd, the practiced motion of a man who had built a career on making cruelty look like generosity. "Go rest, doctor. Sun's clearly gotten to you." He walked away, and the crowd, uncertain and hungry for its ordinary business, began to disperse, and within a few minutes it was as though nothing at all had happened in the square except a strange woman making a strange accusation that respectable people would agree, over supper that night, to simply forget. Dorothy folded her ledger page back into her bag with hands that were shaking, though she would not have admitted that to anyone. Nelson Monroe crossed the square to her. "You want some water?" he asked. "You look like you could use it, and not on account of the sun, whatever he says." She looked up at him properly for the first time. He was perhaps 30, lean in the way that came from long days in a saddle rather than hunger, with a sun-weathered face that had not yet hardened into the permanent squint so many riders got, and dark eyes that held steady on hers instead of sliding away the way most men's did when a woman spoke too plainly for their comfort. "I have water," she said. "What I need is somebody in this territory besides me who's willing to say out loud that Elias Kirkwood is a criminal." "I just did," Nelson said. "You said his handwriting was suspicious. That's not the same as calling him a criminal." "No," Nelson agreed easily. "But it's a start, and starts matter." He held out his hand. "Nelson Monroe. I carry mail out of Fort Benton, twice a month up through here and on to the Blackfoot Agency, then back." She shook his hand. Her grip was firmer than he expected, a doctor's grip, careful and exact. "Dorothy Atwood." "I know," he said. "Half this territory knows Dr. Atwood. You delivered the Hendricks baby breech last winter out past Sun River. My route partner talks about it like it was a miracle." "It nearly wasn't," she said, though something in her had softened slightly at hearing that someone somewhere remembered a good thing she had done rather than only the trouble she caused. "Why did you speak up back there? You didn't have to." Nelson considered the question seriously, the way he seemed to consider most things. Man who reads other men's mail for a living, even just the outsides of it, the addresses, the return names, learns things, he said. "I know Kirkwood's had 3 complaints filed against him in Fort Benton about shorted goods. I know 2 of those complaints disappeared before they reached a judge. I figured somebody willing to stand up in a public square, with proof, deserved to have at least one person stand with her. Even a male rider nobody important listens to. You're the first person in 2 years to call plain evidence what it is instead of calling me difficult." "Difficult and right aren't opposites," Nelson said. "Seems to me you can be both at once, and usually are." It was, without either of them quite recognizing it yet, the beginning of something, though what occupied both their minds in that moment was not romance but the more urgent, more practical fact that Dorothy Atwood had just made a dangerous enemy in front of the entire town, and neither of them yet knew how dangerous he intended to be. 3 days later, the widow Sarah Kettering's well ran dry. It happened without warning, the way wells sometimes did when an underground channel shifted or silted, and it happened at the worst possible time, in the middle of a golden, dry summer when the creek that fed the surrounding homestead fields had already dropped low, and every family in the valley below Coldwater Pass depended on a scattering of wells that had, until now, always been reliable. Sarah Kettering had buried her husband the previous autumn and was raising 2 young sons alone on a homestead a mile outside town, and when her well gave nothing but a bucket of mud and the smell of dry stone, She did what anyone in her position would do. She walked into Coldwater Pass and asked for help. It was Dorothy who found her first, sitting on the trading post steps with her boys close beside her, looking less frightened than simply exhausted in the particular way of a person who has run out of solutions and is too proud to cry about it in public. "Sarah," Dorothy said, crouching to her level. "What's happened?" "Well's dry," Sarah said. "Dry as a bone, Dr. Atwood. I don't know what I'm going to do. Can't haul enough creek water for the stock and the garden and the boys both, not with the walk being what it is." It was in that same hour, as it happened, that a stranger rode into Coldwater Pass leading a second horse loaded with an unusual collection of gear: a canvas bag of surveying tools, a coil of forked willow branches tied carefully so they would not snap, and a manner about him that suggested a man in no particular hurry to be anywhere else. He introduced himself at the trading post as a well-finder, a man who worked the divining rod for hire across 4 territories, and said his name was Amos Fell, and that he had heard, 3 towns back, that Coldwater Pass might have water trouble coming, on account of the drought pattern moving through the region that season, and he had time to spare and thought he would see if anybody needed him. It was a strange kind of luck, the sort that made superstitious folk cross themselves and practical folk simply shrug and say the world worked in patterns nobody fully understood, that a well-finder should arrive in the exact week that a well went dry. But there it was. Nelson, delivering that week's mail sack to the post, overheard the conversation and thought immediately of Sarah Kettering, whom he had known since she was a girl, back before she married, back before the fever took her husband the way it had taken Dorothy's. "There's a widow a mile out whose well just quit," he told Amos Fell. "2 boys, no husband, no money to speak of for a proper well crew out from Fort Benton. If you're looking for honest work, that's about as honest as it comes." Amos Fell, a weathered man of perhaps 50 with kind, tired eyes, nodded slowly. "I don't charge widows the standard rate," he said. "Never have. Show me the place." Dorothy insisted on coming along, partly out of concern for Sarah and her boys, and partly, if she was honest with herself, because she wanted to see whether this divining business was genuine skill or the kind of theater that preyed on desperate people. She had encountered too many of the latter in her medical work, men who sold tonics that did nothing, and she had little patience left for charlatans. Nelson came as well, because his mail route did not resume until the following morning, and because, though he would not have said so aloud yet, he wanted an excuse to spend the afternoon in Dorothy Atwood's company. At Sarah Kettering's homestead, Amos Fell dismounted, took up his forked willow branch, held it loosely in both hands the way a man holds something he trusts completely, and began to walk the dry, sun-cracked yard in slow, methodical lines. "Looks like foolishness to me," Dorothy admitted quietly to Nelson as they watched. "I've read about divining. There's no scientific mechanism by which a willow branch could detect groundwater." "Maybe," Nelson said. "Or maybe there's things science hasn't caught up to explaining yet. I've watched 3 well-finders work in my years riding this territory. 2 were frauds sure enough. One found water 4 separate times for 4 separate families, deep enough and clean enough that nobody argued with him afterward. That's one man's luck, not proof of anything." "Could be," Nelson said, and there was no offense in his voice, only easy amusement. "You're a woman who wants proof for everything, aren't you? I'm a doctor. Proof keeps people alive." "Fair enough. But sometimes the proof's just standing there waiting for you to see it, even if you don't understand the why of it yet." The willow branch in Amos Fell's hands dipped suddenly, sharply, near a stand of chokecherry bushes at the edge of the yard, dipped hard enough that the old man's forearms visibly strained against it. "Here," he said. "Right about here, 20, maybe 25 feet down. Good water, moving water, not standing. You dig here, you won't have this trouble again for a long while." Sarah Kettering, who had watched the whole demonstration with her arms wrapped tight around herself, let out a small, shaking breath. "Are you certain?" "Nothing in this life is certain, ma'am," Amos said gently. But I've been doing this 30 years, and this branch has never lied to me yet that I could prove otherwise. I'll stay and help you dig it myself if you'll feed me supper for my trouble. Don't need coin from you." Dorothy found herself watching not the willow branch but Nelson, who had already shrugged off his coat and was rolling up his sleeves. "I'll dig too," he said. "Mail doesn't run again until morning. 2 men digging is faster than 1, and this family's waited long enough." "You don't have to do that," Sarah said. "I know," Nelson said, "doing it anyway." And that, Dorothy thought, watching him pick up a shovel that had been leaning against the barn, was perhaps the truest thing she had learned about him yet. He did not do things because he had to. He did things because not doing them would have sat wrong with him afterward, and he seemed constitutionally unable to tolerate that particular kind of wrongness. She rolled up her own sleeves. "I'll help as well," she said. "I can't divine water, but I can dig a hole same as any man here." The 3 of them, along with Sarah's older boy, who was 9 and insisted on carrying water despite his mother's protests, worked through the golden afternoon light, the digging slow and hard in ground that had not seen rain in weeks, the dirt coming up in dry, crumbling clods that gave way eventually to darker, damper soil as they went deeper. Nelson worked steadily, without complaint, and Dorothy found herself watching the economy of his movements, the way he paced himself for the long haul rather than exhausting himself early, the same careful competence she recognized in her own hands when she worked through a difficult birth or a bad wound. There was something deeply attractive, she realized with some surprise, in watching a person do difficult physical work well without vanity, simply because the work needed doing. By the time the light went orange and long across the plains, the hole was perhaps 18 feet deep, and the air coming up from it had changed, grown cooler, carrying the mineral smell of wet earth. "There," Amos Fell called down to Nelson, who had taken the last turn in the pit. "You're close. Dig easy now." Nelson's shovel struck through a final layer of packed clay, and water welled up around his boots, clear and cold, rising steadily. The boy let out a whoop that startled a pair of crows off the barn roof, and Sarah Kettering pressed both hands over her mouth, and Dorothy found herself laughing, a real laugh, the first one she could remember in longer than she wanted to admit, watching Nelson Monroe stand grinning in a hole full of rising well water with mud to his elbows, looking entirely, foolishly pleased with himself. "Well, Doctor," he called up to her, "you get your proof after all." "I suppose I do," she said, and found she could not stop smiling at him. That evening, after the well had been properly lined with stone from Sarah's rock pile, and a rough cover built to keep debris out, after supper had been eaten, roasted chicken and new potatoes that Sarah insisted on sharing despite having little enough to spare, Dorothy and Nelson rode back toward Coldwater Pass together under a sky gone the deep violet blue of a summer evening, the first stars just beginning to prick through. "You surprised me today," Dorothy said. "How's that? Most men I've met out here, if they help a widow, they make certain everybody knows about it afterward. You just picked up a shovel." "Didn't think it needed announcing," Nelson said. "Man does a decent thing's its own reward, doesn't need a parade." Thomas used to say something like that. She had not meant to bring up her husband and felt the words leave her before she could stop them. Nelson did not flinch or grow awkward the way most people did when the dead were mentioned. "Your husband," he said simply. "I'm sorry for your loss, Dr. Atwood. I mean that plainly, not as a thing to say and move past. Thank you. It's been 2 years. People think that should be long enough to stop grieving. It isn't, not really. It just becomes a quieter kind of grief." "I lost my brother 5 years back," Nelson said after a moment. "Younger than me by 2 years. We were riding fence line together out past Miles City when his horse threw him wrong. I've carried mail on this route ever since, partly because it was his idea first, the mail route, and I couldn't let the idea die with him. Every letter I deliver, every promise I keep to get somebody's mail through on time no matter the weather, feels like keeping a piece of him going." Dorothy looked at him with new understanding. "That's why you spoke up in the square, against Kirkwood." "Partly," Nelson admitted. "My brother hated bullies worse than anything. Elias Kirkwood is exactly the kind of man he'd have wanted somebody to stand against. They rode in comfortable quiet for a while after that, the horses' hooves soft against the dry summer road, and Dorothy found herself unwilling to let the silence stretch too long, wanting instead to know more of this steady, unassuming man who dug wells for strangers and spoke of his dead brother without flinching. "Tell me about the mail route," she said. "All of it. I want to understand what kind of life makes a man like you." So he told her, as the stars came out fully overhead, about the 60-mile stretch between Fort Benton and the Blackfoot Agency, the way the road climbed through Coldwater Pass and over into rougher country beyond, about the promises he had made and kept, letters delivered through blizzards, a payroll sack he had once defended from a pair of thieves by simply outrunning them for 11 miles because he refused to be the man who lost a rancher's wages. About an elderly widower up near the agency line who received no mail at all most weeks, but whom Nelson stopped to visit anyway, because a man alone needed somebody to check on him, even when there was no letter to justify the stop. "That's not a job," Dorothy said. "That's a vocation." "Maybe," Nelson said. "Feels less like choosing and more like the only way I know how to be useful in the world. I understand that better than you might think." They reached the edge of Coldwater Pass, the trading post's lantern light glowing warm in the deepening dark, and Nelson walked her horse to the small house she kept at the edge of town, the one she used as her infirmary between her circuit rides. "Dr. Atwood," he said, as she dismounted. "Dorothy, if I might call you that, you might. I want you to be careful. Kirkwood's not a man who forgets being challenged, particularly not in public, particularly not by a woman he can't easily control. What you did in that square took real courage, but courage doesn't stop a bullet or a bad accident arranged to look accidental." "I've considered that," she said. "I have the evidence. I intend to send it to the Territorial Marshal's office in Fort Benton. Once it's out of my hands and into official ones, there's less reason for Kirkwood to come after me specifically." "Less reason," Nelson agreed, "but not no reason. A man like that doesn't think in terms of reason. He thinks in terms of what serves him. Right now, silencing you serves him, evidence or no evidence, because if you're not around to testify to how you found it, a clever lawyer can make the whole thing look like fabrication. You think he'd have me killed?" "I think," Nelson said carefully, "that I'd rather not find out the hard way. I'd like to keep riding my mail route through Coldwater Pass and finding you still here, still stubborn, still calling powerful men criminals to their faces. If that's agreeable to you." Something in his plain, careful way of saying it, no flowery declaration, simply an honest man stating an honest hope, moved her more than any grander speech could have. "That's agreeable," she said. "Very agreeable." He tipped his hat to her, the gesture somehow both old-fashioned and entirely sincere, and rode off into the dark toward the small room he kept above the livery stable, and Dorothy stood a long moment in her own doorway watching the dark swallow him up, feeling something in her chest that she had not felt in 2 long years, something that felt dangerously, wonderfully like hope. The letter reached Fort Benton 8 days later, carried not by Nelson's regular route, but by a special rider Dorothy paid out of her own savings, because she trusted no one else with evidence this important and did not want to wait the 2 weeks until Nelson's scheduled return trip. It detailed everything: the doctored ledger, the rigged scale, the pattern of sickened children, sworn statements from 3 families willing to testify. She sent a copy as well to a newspaper editor in Fort Benton whom she had once treated for a broken arm and who owed her, if not loyalty exactly, at least a debt of professional courtesy. Word came back within the week that a territorial marshal would be dispatched to investigate, expected to arrive within the month. Elias Kirkwood, informed of this by a supplier who traveled frequently between Coldwater Pass and Fort Benton, and who valued Kirkwood's business more than his conscience, understood immediately what a month meant. A month was enough time for a marshal to arrive, gather testimony, and end his comfortable arrangement permanently, possibly ending his freedom along with it. A month, alternatively, was time enough to make certain problems disappear before that marshal ever set foot in Coldwater Pass. He called a meeting, not in the square this time but in the back room of his trading post, with two men whose names Dorothy would later learn were Cyrus Beale and a younger man called Whit Sorensen, both of whom had done unspoken work for Kirkwood before, moving goods that were not entirely legal, discouraging complaints with methods that never quite rose to the level of a crime a sheriff could prosecute. "There's a bounty," Kirkwood told them plainly. $200 for whoever makes certain Dr. Atwood never testifies to that marshal. I don't care how it's arranged. An accident, a robbery gone wrong, a fever she can't cure in herself for once. I only care that it's done before that marshal crosses the pass." It was Whit Sorensen, younger and greener than Cyrus Beale, who let the arrangement slip 3 nights later in a moment of drunken boasting at the saloon, bragging to a woman he was trying to impress that he was about to come into real money, more money than a man made honest work in this territory. The woman, a laundress named Ida Coyle, who happened also to be one of Nelson's oldest friends from his years riding this route, mentioned it to Nelson the very next morning when he stopped by to collect a package. $200, Ida said, scrubbing hard at a shirt collar, not quite meeting Nelson's eyes because she knew the weight of what she was telling him. Whit didn't say the doctor's name outright, but he said the lady Sawbones who's been stirring up trouble about the flour, and there's only one woman that could be. Nelson felt something cold and immediate settle into his chest. "When?" "Before the marshal arrives," is all he said. "Nelson, I don't want trouble finding its way to my door for telling you this." "It won't," Nelson said. "I owe you for it, Ida, more than you know." He rode straight to Dorothy's infirmary, arriving mid-morning to find her setting a boy's broken arm, and waited, forcing himself to patience he did not feel, until she had finished and sent the boy and his father on their way with instructions and a sling. "Nelson," she said, noting immediately the tightness in his face. "What's happened?" "Kirkwood's put a price on you," he said. No gentle preamble, because there was no version of this news that gentleness could soften. $200 to whoever makes certain you don't testify when that marshal arrives. I got it second-hand, but I trust the source completely. Dorothy sat down slowly in the chair beside her examination table, and Nelson watched her absorb the news the way he imagined she absorbed hard diagnoses, a brief stillness, a visible act of will to keep her hands from shaking, and then a return to something steady and clear-eyed. "How long do we have?" "Marshal's expected within 3 weeks, best I heard. Kirkwood will want it done well before that. Could be days." "I won't stop practicing medicine," Dorothy said immediately. "I won't hide and I won't run. People in this valley need me, and running would look exactly like the guilt Kirkwood wants people to believe about me." "I know," Nelson said. "I wasn't going to ask you to run. I was going to ask you to let me stay close. My route can flex some. I can ride the shorter loops for a few weeks, spend my nights here in Coldwater Pass instead of pushing on toward the agency each time. You'd disrupt your entire route for me." "I've disrupted it before for less good reason," Nelson said. "Dorothy, I'm not offering because I think you can't protect yourself. I've watched you dig a well and set a bone, and stand up to a man twice your size in a public square without your voice shaking. I'm offering because 2 people watching for trouble see more than one, and because I'd rather be here and not needed than needed and not here." She looked at him for a long moment, weighing the offer, weighing too, though she did not say it aloud, the way her chest had gone warm and unsteady at the plain sincerity of his voice. "All right," she said finally, "but you're not doing this alone either. If Kirkwood's hired men, we need to know who, and we need evidence of the bounty itself, not just second-hand talk, if we want the marshal to act on it as its own crime." "Agreed," Nelson said. "I know somebody who might help with that too." The somebody was Amos Fell, the well-finder who had not yet left Coldwater Pass, having found steady work locating water for 3 more homesteads in the surrounding valley, and having, in his own quiet way, taken a liking to the town and its people. When Nelson explained the situation, Amos did not hesitate. "I've got no divining rod that finds hired killers," he said, "but I've got eyes, and I've spent 30 years reading people the way I read groundwater. I'll keep watch around the edges of town, see who comes and goes that shouldn't." Over the following days, a careful, quiet effort took shape. Amos fell, moving between homesteads on his water-finding work, kept watch on the roads into Coldwater Pass, and noted the comings and goings of Cyrus Beale and Whit Sorensen. Nelson shortened his route, riding the 20 miles to the agency and back within a single long day instead of camping partway as he usually did, so that he could be in Coldwater Pass most nights. Dorothy continued her work exactly as before, treating patients, riding her circuit to the nearer homesteads, refusing to give Kirkwood the satisfaction of watching her hide. It was on the 6th day that the danger became concrete instead of theoretical. Dorothy had ridden out alone, against Nelson's mild but persistent objection, to check on a homesteader's wife 3 miles south who was expecting her first child within the month, and had sent word of troubling pains. The visit itself went smoothly, the pains proving to be nothing more serious than the ordinary discomforts of late pregnancy, and Dorothy started back toward Coldwater Pass in the late afternoon with the golden light slanting long across the wheat fields, feeling, for the first time in days, something like ease. The ease did not last. A quarter-mile from the trading post, where the road narrowed between a stand of cottonwoods and a steep, dry gully, a rider stepped his horse out from among the trees and blocked her path. It was Cyrus Beale, a heavy-set man with a face like weathered leather and a rifle resting casually across his saddle in a way that was meant to look casual and did not quite manage it. "Dr. Atwood," he said, "funny running into you out here alone." Dorothy's hand went instinctively to the small pistol she had begun carrying in her saddlebag since Nelson's warning, though she did not draw it yet, calculating the distance, the angle, the risk of provoking a man already holding a rifle. "Mr. Beale," she said, keeping her voice level, "is there something you need? Medical attention, perhaps?" "Nothing wrong with me," Beale said, walking his horse a few steps closer. "Though I hear there's something mighty wrong with you, talking too much to the wrong people about the wrong subjects. A woman ought to know when to keep her mouth shut." "I'll take that under advisement," Dorothy said, and in the same breath drew her pistol from the saddlebag, not aiming it yet, simply making its presence known. "I'd also advise you that threatening a physician within earshot of witnesses is a poor career choice, Mr. Beale, whatever Elias Kirkwood is paying you." Something flickered across his face, surprised that she knew about the arrangement, and in that half-second of hesitation, hooves sounded fast on the road behind her. Nelson came around the bend at a hard gallop, having ridden out to meet her when she was later returning than expected, and took in the scene, the rifle, the pistol, the standoff, in a single sweeping glance. "Beale," he called out, reining his horse hard between Dorothy and the other man, positioning himself deliberately in the likely line of any shot. "You want to think real careful about your next move. I've got a rifle of my own and better aim than you, and there's a marshal 3 weeks out who'd be mighty interested in a man caught threatening a witness." Beale's jaw worked, calculation visible on his face, weighing the $200 bounty against the immediate armed reality in front of him. "This ain't your business, male rider." "Made it my business," Nelson said. "You want to shoot somebody today, you'll have to go through me first, and I promise you that'll cost Kirkwood a good deal more than $200 to clean up afterward." For a long, taut moment nobody moved, the only sound the restless shifting of horses and the distant call of a hawk somewhere overhead. Then Beale, calculating correctly that the odds had shifted badly against him, spat once into the dust, wheeled his horse, and rode off toward the trading post without another word. Dorothy let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "You're bleeding," she said suddenly, noticing for the first time a dark stain spreading at Nelson's shoulder. "Beale got a shot off before you rode up," he said, wincing now that the immediate danger had passed and his body had permission to feel the wound. Grazed me. Nothing serious, let me see. She was off her horse in an instant, doctor's instincts overriding everything else, guiding him down from his saddle and tearing his shirt sleeve to examine the wound, a shallow furrow along the outside of his upper arm, painful but, as he'd said, not serious. You could have been killed protecting me, she said, her hands steady as they worked but her voice betraying something rower underneath. Could have, Nelson agreed. Wasn't going to let that stop me, though. Why? The question came out sharper than she intended, frustration and fear tangled together. Why would you take a bullet for a woman you've known less than 2 weeks? Nelson looked at her, and despite the pain evident in the tightness around his eyes, something gentle came into his expression. Because in 2 weeks you've shown me more courage and more decency than most people show in a lifetime, he said. Because watching you dig a well, watching you set a broken bone, watching you stand up to Kirkwood in that square, I've come to think you're about the finest person I've met since my brother died. That's not a small thing to me, Dorothy. That's not nothing. She finished binding the wound in silence, her hands trembling now that the adrenaline was fading, and when she was done she did not step back immediately, staying close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, close enough that the space between them had become charged with something neither of them had said aloud yet. I think, she said quietly, that I have come to feel something similar about you. Dorothy, don't, she said, though not unkindly. Don't say anything yet. Let's survive Elias Kirkwood first, then we'll have time for the rest of it. He nodded, understanding, and together they rode the last quarter-mile into Coldwater Pass, slower now, careful of his wound, closer together than they had ridden before. The encounter with Beale changed the calculation for everyone involved. Nelson reported it immediately to the town's part-time constable, an aging former soldier named Otis Pratt who had little real authority, but enough standing to make an official record. And word spread quickly through Coldwater Pass that Cyrus Beale had drawn a weapon on Dr. Atwood in broad daylight. Public opinion, which had wavered uncertainly after Kirkwood's smooth dismissal of Dorothy's original accusation, began to shift decisively. People remembered, suddenly and vividly, all the small unfairnesses they had swallowed from Kirkwood over the years, the shorted goods, the inflated prices during hard winters, the way complaints against him always seemed to evaporate. Sarah Kettering, whose well Nelson and Amos Fell had dug, spoke openly now to anyone who would listen about the kindness shown to her family and the character it revealed in both Nelson and Dorothy. The sickened children's families, emboldened by growing public sympathy, came forward with their own statements, no longer content to wait quietly for a distant marshal. Kirkwood, feeling the ground shift beneath him, grew reckless. It was Amos Fell who brought the next piece of the puzzle, arriving at Dorothy's infirmary late one evening with dirt still on his boots from a day spent divining water for a homestead near the base of the pass. "There's a bridge out on the Fort Benton Road," he said. "The one that crosses Coldwater Creek about 8 miles east, where the road narrows into the canyon before it climbs toward the agency. Spring flooding weakened the central support beam months back, and nobody's had the money or the will to properly repair it, just shored it up temporary-like with green timber that won't hold much longer. I was out that way today and noticed fresh saw marks on that support beam. Somebody's been working at it deliberately, weakening it further." Nelson's face went grim. "That's the bridge the marshal will have to cross to reach Coldwater Pass. It's the only crossing for 15 miles in either direction on account of the canyon walls. You think Kirkwood means to collapse the bridge and stop the marshal from ever arriving?" Dorothy asked. "Or worse," Nelson said, "time it to collapse while the marshal's actually crossing. Wouldn't be the first time a bridge failure got blamed on nature instead of a man saw." "There's also," Amos added grimly, "a wagon train of settler families I passed on my way back, 6 wagons, families heading up toward new land grants past the agency, planning to cross that same bridge within the next 2 days. If it's rigged to fail, it's not just the marshal at risk. Dorothy felt the full weight of the danger settle over her. This was no longer only about her own safety, or even about justice for Kirkwood's crimes. Innocent families, children among them, were now walking directly into danger neither they nor anyone, but a handful of people yet understood. "We have to warn them," she said immediately. "We have to repair that bridge properly before anyone crosses it again." "That's a 2-day job even with a full crew and proper lumber," Nelson said. "We don't have 2 days if that wagon train's as close as Amos says." "Then we work through the night if we must," Dorothy said. "Nelson, you know timber and construction from your route work, don't you? Repairing washed-out sections of trail." "Some," Nelson admitted. "Enough to shore up a weak beam properly if we've got the right materials and enough hands." "I'll ride to the homesteads nearest the bridge," Amos offered. "Round up whoever's willing to help. Most folks in this valley have reason enough by now to want Kirkwood stopped." They moved quickly. Word spread through Coldwater Pass and the surrounding homesteads within hours, carried by riders in every direction, and by the following dawn a small crew had gathered at the damaged bridge. Nelson, Dorothy, Amos Fell, Otis Pratt the constable, Sarah Kettering's older boy insisting on helping despite his mother's worry, and 4 homesteader men who had grown weary of Kirkwood's long shadow over their valley and were glad of any chance to work against him. The bridge itself was a modest wooden structure spanning perhaps 40 feet across Coldwater Creek, where it ran fast and deep through a narrow rock canyon, the water below churning white over boulders in a drop that would mean serious injury or death to anyone who fell. The central support beam, when Nelson climbed down to examine it closely, showed clear evidence of deliberate sabotage, fresh saw cuts weakening the wood at precisely the point of greatest load, cuts cleverly hidden beneath a layer of mud and old moss so that a casual inspection would miss them entirely. "Whoever did this knew what they were doing," Nelson called up. "Another few days of wagon traffic, maybe less with a heavy load, and this beam gives way entirely. Anybody crossing when it goes drops 30 feet into that water." "Can it be repaired?" Dorothy asked, kneeling at the canyon's edge to see better. "With the right timber, yes. We'll need to jack the whole structure up enough to remove the damaged beam and replace it, brace it from below while we work. It's dangerous work and it's slow." "We don't have slow," Amos reminded him. "Rider I sent ahead says that wagon train's making good time. They could reach this crossing by tomorrow afternoon." They worked through the day and into the night, torches and lanterns providing what light they could once the sun went down, the sound of saws and hammers and the rushing creek below filling the canyon with a strange, urgent music. Dorothy, unable to contribute much to the carpentry itself, made herself useful treating the inevitable minor injuries, splinters and pinched fingers and one man's twisted ankle from a misplaced step, and organizing the effort's logistics, food and water and rest rotations, so that no one worked past the point of dangerous exhaustion. It was during a brief rest near midnight, both of them sitting on a flat rock a little apart from the others with mugs of hot coffee that Sarah Kettering had sent along with her son, that Dorothy found herself studying Nelson in the lantern light, sawdust in his hair, his shirt soaked through with sweat despite the cool night air, and felt something in her chest settle into certainty. "You're good at this," she said. "The bridge work. I didn't know you had this in you beyond the riding." "Learned it from my father," Nelson said. "He built half the barns in this county before he passed. I picked up enough to be useful, though I'm no master carpenter." "You're modest." "That beam you're setting looks stronger than the original." "Maybe," he admitted, allowing himself a tired smile. "I want it to hold for more than just this wagon train and this marshal, Dorothy. I want it to hold for years, for every family that crosses this creek after us. Doesn't feel right to do a thing halfway when people's lives depend on it." "That's the same thing I think every time I set a bone or stitch a wound," she said. "Do it right, or don't bother doing it at all." "Seems we think alike on more than one thing." "Seems we do." The moment stretched between them, warm despite the cool mountain air, charged with everything they had not yet fully said to each other. Nelson set down his coffee mug. "Dorothy, I know we agreed to wait until this business with Kirkwood was settled, but I find myself needing to say at least this much now, in case tomorrow brings trouble neither of us can predict. I have never in my life met a woman like you. Brave in ways that don't need announcing, kind in ways that don't ask for thanks, stubborn enough to stand against a man everyone else was too frightened to challenge. I think I have been falling in love with you since I watched you dig that well with mud to your elbows and laugh like you meant it. I don't expect an answer tonight. I only needed you to know it plainly, the same way you'd want any hard truth told to you plainly." Dorothy's breath caught, and for a long moment she said nothing, simply looking at him in the flickering torchlight, at the honest, open way he had said something so enormous without demanding anything back for it. "I have not let myself feel this since Thomas died," she said finally, her voice unsteady in a way that surprised her. "I told myself it would be disloyal to his memory, or foolish given how dangerous my life is, or simply impossible given how much of myself I give to my work. But I have been falling in love with you too, Nelson Monroe, since you stood up in that square when nobody else would, and every day since has only made it truer. Thomas would want me to be happy. I understand that now. He was never a man who wanted me small or cautious. I don't think you are either." "No," Nelson said softly. "I want you exactly as large as you already are." He reached out slowly, and she let him take her hand, and in the torchlit dark above the rushing creek, with a repaired bridge still incomplete beneath them and danger still very much unresolved, they kissed for the first time, gentle and certain, a promise made quietly between two people who had already proven to each other, through action rather than words, exactly what kind of partners they intended to be. They returned to the work before long, because the bridge was not yet finished and lives depended on its completion, but something had shifted permanently between them, a warmth that neither exhaustion nor danger could fully dim. By mid-morning the following day, the repair was complete, the new support beam solid and true, tested by Nelson himself walking its length with a wagon load of stone to confirm its strength before any real traffic crossed. The wagon train, 6 families with their oxen and their children and their modest collection of possessions, meant to build new lives past the agency, arrived at the bridge in the early afternoon to find it not the death trap Kirkwood had intended, but a solid, safe crossing, manned by a small crew of exhausted but triumphant volunteers who waved them across with genuine relief. The families never knew, most of them, how close they had come to disaster, nor how much effort had gone into saving them from it. That was, Dorothy reflected as she watched the wagons roll safely across, precisely the point of the work they did, hers and Nelson's both. The best rescues were often the ones nobody but the rescuers ever fully understood. Word of the sabotaged bridge, however, spread quickly through Coldwater Pass once the crew returned, carried by Otis Pratt in his official capacity as constable. And this time there was no smooth dismissal Kirkwood could offer that would satisfy a town already primed to believe the worst of him. Attempted sabotage of a public bridge, endangering settler families and a territorial marshal alike, was a crime of an entirely different order than shorted flour sacks, and even Kirkwood's remaining allies in town began quietly distancing themselves. Kirkwood, cornered and desperate, made his final and most reckless move 2 nights later. He came to Dorothy's infirmary himself, alone, in the deep hours of the night, believing perhaps that a direct and private confrontation might succeed where hired men had failed. Dorothy was alone in the building, Nelson having ridden a short errand to check on a homestead family, and she woke to the sound of her door being forced. Kirkwood stood in her doorway, a revolver in his hand, his face stripped of the smooth confidence that had carried him through years of unchallenged authority, replaced now by something raw and frightened, and therefore more dangerous. "You've ruined everything," he said. "Years of careful work, and you've ruined it with your ledgers and your bridges and your male rider protector. The marshal will hang me if he finds evidence of the bridge. I need that evidence, Dr. Atwood, and I need your silence, and I intend to have both tonight. Dorothy, moving with the deliberate calm she had trained into herself through years of medical emergencies, kept her hands visible and her voice level. Killing me won't erase the testimony already given, Mr. Kirkwood. The families whose children sicken have spoken. Otis Pratt has recorded the bridge sabotage. Sarah Kettering, half the homesteaders in this valley, they've all seen what you are now. My death changes nothing except adding murder to the charges against you. It changes the strongest witness, Kirkwood snapped, though something uncertain flickered behind his eyes, as though he was hearing, perhaps for the first time, the truth of what she said. Without you, it's just scattered talk. With you, it's proof. Then you'll have to shoot an unarmed woman in her own home, in front of whatever witnesses my screaming brings, Dorothy said, and reached slowly, deliberately, for the small bell she kept on her bedside table for exactly this kind of emergency, rung to summon help from neighboring buildings. Her hand closed on it and she rang it hard, 3 sharp peals cutting through the night air. Kirkwood's revolver came up, his finger tightening, and in that fraction of a second Dorothy threw herself sideways, using the heavy examination table as cover, feeling the shot pass close enough to stir the air near her ear, splintering wood behind her. Nelson, returning from his errand and hearing both the bell and the shot, kicked the door the rest of the way open, and was through it in an instant, tackling Kirkwood before he could fire again, the 2 men crashing into the shelf of medical supplies, glass bottles shattering around them. The struggle was brief and ugly, Kirkwood fighting with the desperate strength of a cornered man, Nelson with the controlled fury of someone protecting the person he loved. It ended with Kirkwood's revolver skidding across the floor, and Nelson's forearm pressed hard against the man's throat, pinning him against the wall. "You're finished," Nelson said, breathing hard. Marshal or no marshal, every soul in this valley just heard that shot and knows exactly whose gun it was. Otis Pratt arrived within minutes, drawn by the bell and the gunshot along with half a dozen neighbors, and Kirkwood was taken into custody that same night, charged formally with the sabotage of the bridge, the attempted murder of Dorothy Atwood, and once the marshal arrived a week later than originally planned due to unrelated delays, the earlier fraud charges as well. Dorothy, checking Nelson for injuries in the aftermath with hands that would not quite stop shaking despite her best professional composure, found herself laughing and crying at once, the tension of weeks finally breaking. "You keep arriving exactly when I need you," she said. "I begin to wonder how you manage it." "I told you once," Nelson said, pulling her carefully into an embrace, mindful of her shaken state. "I don't abandon a promise or a person on my road. You're the most important stop on that road now, Dorothy. I intend to keep arriving." The marshal, when he finally arrived, found a town already largely settled in its judgment of Elias Kirkwood, statements gathered, evidence catalogued, a constable's official report of the bridge sabotage and the attempted murder both. Kirkwood was transported to Fort Benton to await trial, his trading post seized, and its assets used, by order of the territorial court some months later, to compensate the families he had defrauded and to fund the very well-digging and bridge maintenance efforts the valley had lacked for so long. Cyrus Beale, arrested separately when Otis Pratt tracked him down at a neighboring settlement, testified against Kirkwood in exchange for a lighter sentence, confirming the bounty and the bridge sabotage both, closing the final gaps in the case entirely. Whit Sorensen, the younger and less hardened of Kirkwood's hired men, fled the territory entirely rather than face judgment, and was never seen in Coldwater Pass again, though word came eventually, second-hand and unreliable, that he had taken up honest ranch work somewhere down near the Wyoming line, perhaps having learned in his own stumbling way the cost of the company he'd kept. With Kirkwood's fall, Coldwater Pass began, slowly and imperfectly, to heal. A new trading post owner, a fair-dealing man named Reuben Castellano who had run an honest store in Fort Benton for years, arrived to take over the business, and the town's ledgers, quite literally, were set right. Dorothy Atwood found herself, in the weeks following, more settled in Coldwater Pass than she had been anywhere since Thomas's death, though her circuit work still called her regularly to the surrounding settlements. Nelson's mail route resumed its normal rhythm, twice-monthly runs to the agency and back, though he made certain, every single time, to route his return journey through Coldwater Pass rather than the more direct path, so that he might spend at least one night in 6 there instead of none. It was on one of those evenings, nearly 2 months after Kirkwood's arrest, with the golden late summer light stretching long and warm across the wheat fields, and the wells throughout the valley running full and steady after a season of good, hard-won rain, that Nelson found Dorothy sitting on the steps of her infirmary, mending a torn saddlebag with the careful, precise stitches of a woman equally skilled at closing wounds and repairing leather. "You've got a look about you," he said, settling beside her. "Thinking hard on something." "I've been offered a permanent position," she said. "The Territorial Medical Board wrote to me. There's a settlement forming up near the agency, growing fast with the new families coming through. They want a physician to stay permanently, build a proper clinic, not just ride circuit through occasionally." Nelson felt something complicated move through his chest, pride and fear tangled together. "That's a fine offer," he said carefully. "You've earned it, all your years of riding circuit with nobody to help you, and precious little thanks for the trouble." "I haven't decided to take it," she said. "I wanted to talk with you first." "Why with me?" "Because," she said, setting down her needle and thread and turning to face him fully, "I don't want to build a life that doesn't include you in it, Nelson Monroe. And I know your route keeps you moving, keeps you tied to promises up and down 60 miles of road that matter to you as much as any settled life could. I've been trying to think how those two things fit together, a settled physician and a traveling male rider, and I confess I haven't solved it neatly." Nelson took her hand, turning it over gently in his own, tracing the calluses on her palm that came from years of hard, honest work. "Maybe it doesn't need solving neatly," he said. "Maybe the answer isn't you staying still while I keep moving, or me staying still while you keep moving. Maybe the answer is we move together." "What do you mean?" "I mean," he said, "that settlement near the agency is right along my route already. I could keep riding the mail and you could build your clinic there, and instead of me stopping in Coldwater Pass one night in 6, I'd be coming home to you every single trip. And when your work calls you further out, to homesteads and settlements along the way, I could carry you there myself on my regular runs, official male rider escort for the territory's finest physician. We wouldn't be choosing between your calling and mine, Dorothy. We'd be building a life that has room for both." Dorothy felt her eyes sting with unexpected tears, the kind that come not from sorrow but from a happiness too large to hold quietly. "You would do that? Restructure your whole life around fitting alongside mine?" "I'm not restructuring anything," Nelson said. "I'm just finally admitting that the road I've been riding these 5 years has been leading me somewhere all along, even before I knew what it was. Seems to me it was leading me to you." "I love you," Dorothy said, the words coming easily now, worn smooth by weeks of certainty. "I have loved you, I think, since the moment you stood up in that square and called my evidence what it was, evidence, not madness. I want to build this life with you, whatever shape it takes. I don't want safety that comes from staying small and still. I want the kind of safety that comes from having someone beside me while I keep doing difficult, necessary work in a dangerous world." "Then that's exactly what you'll have," Nelson said, "for as long as you'll keep me." "That," Dorothy said, leaning into him, "sounds like it might be quite a long while." They were married 3 weeks later, in a simple ceremony held in the Coldwater Pass Square, the very same platform where Dorothy had once pointed her finger at Elias Kirkwood and changed the course of the entire valley's future. Sarah Kettering stood as witness alongside her 2 boys, the younger of whom presented Dorothy with a small bouquet of wildflowers picked. He announced proudly, from the ground right beside the well Nelson had helped dig. Amos Fell, who had stayed on in the valley longer than he'd originally intended, having grown fond of the people and the work, and quietly, of watching two good souls find each other, gave a short and unexpectedly moving toast about willow branches and the strange, unteachable ways a person learns to trust what they cannot fully explain, whether it was underground water or the certainty of a good match. Otis Pratt performed the legal formalities with visible pride, and half the valley turned out to witness it. Families whose wells had run dry and been dug new. Families whose children had sickened and recovered. Families who had crossed a repaired bridge safely into new lives. All of them come to celebrate the union of the two people who had, in their own quiet and determined way, made the whole valley a little safer and a little fairer. Reuben Castellano, the new trading post owner, provided the wedding feast at cost, insisting it was the least an honest man could offer given everything the valley owed to Dorothy and Nelson both. That evening, as the celebration wound down into the soft blue hours of dusk, and the first stars appeared over the mountains, Dorothy and Nelson stood together at the edge of the square, watching the golden light fade from the wheat fields one last time before the change of season would begin turning it toward autumn. "Ready to start our journey?" Nelson asked, nodding toward the two horses saddled and waiting nearby, packed with Dorothy's medical bags and Nelson's mail satchel both, ready for the road that would lead them, over the following days, toward the growing settlement near the agency where their new life together would properly begin. "I've been ready for this my whole life," Dorothy said. "I just didn't know it until you rode into it." They mounted together, side by side rather than one leading and one following, and rode out of Coldwater Pass in the gathering dusk, past the well that had once run dry and now ran full and clear, past the bridge that had once been sabotaged and now stood solid and true beneath 100 wagon wheels a month, past the trading post square where a corrupt man's power had finally, properly, come to its end. Behind them, Coldwater Pass settled into its evening quiet, a town made stronger and fairer by the courage of one determined woman and the steady, devoted partnership of one mail route rider who had never once, in all his years on that road, abandoned a promise or a person who needed him. Ahead of them lay the road to the agency settlement, and beyond that, 60 miles of Montana plains and mountain pass that Nelson knew as well as his own heartbeat, and beyond that further still, whatever new towns and new needs and new lives their combined work might carry them toward in the years to come. Neither of them knew exactly what waited at the end of that road, what new wells might run dry, what new dangers might arise in a territory still young and still finding its way toward order and fairness. But they rode into the deepening evening together, unafraid of not knowing, because they had already learned the one thing that mattered most, that the safest place in a dangerous world was not a house or a town or even a season of calm, but the steady, chosen presence of a person who would ride toward trouble beside you rather than let you face it alone. The last light faded from the western sky as they crested the first low ridge beyond Coldwater Pass, and somewhere behind them, faint on the evening air, came the sound of Sarah Kettering's boys laughing near their well, water running clean and full, a small good thing set right in a world that had, for one golden summer, asked a great deal of two brave people and given them in return everything that truly mattered. They did not look back. There was no need. Everything worth carrying from Coldwater Pass they carried already, in the saddlebags beside them and in the steady, certain love between them, riding forward into whatever the wide Montana territory had waiting together, exactly as they intended to remain.